morning, good afternoon, good evening, where you may be. Really a pleasure here to be here, and glad to have a distinguished set of panelists, starting with Joe Sullivan, Chief Security Officer from CloudFlare. We have Mary Gardner, Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for F5 Networks. And then we've got Kevin Deierling, Senior Vice President from NVIDIA. And then we have John Kindervag, Field Chief Technology Officer from Palo Alto Networks. And lastly, we have Dr. Ronald Layton, Vice President of Converged Security Operations from Sallie Mae, who also spent a large majority of his career with the US Secret Service. 5 great panelists to have a great conversation this morning. Next slide. So again, my name is Mauricio Sanchez, and I'm from the Dell'Oro group. Today we'll be covering 3 topics that I thought would be very interesting to be able to debate here in the roundtable. In the next set of slides, I'd like to tee up the conversation so that we can level set and provide some context about what we'll be discussing today. Next slide. I think it goes without saying that there's a daunting security challenge, and there's so much to pick from. It's a ripe universe when we talk about cybersecurity. But I picked 3 that I thought would be quite interesting to be able to discuss today. The first one is around the enterprise cloudification, and I've got a couple of double-click slides into each of these to discuss what exactly I'm pointing out. But when we talk about cloudification, it's about that digital transformation of enterprises going from on-prem into public cloud environments. And there's been, unfortunately, a lot of issues and hacks that have happened. So it's quite undoubtedly a huge security challenge. Year 2020, the next one, it's all about the pandemic, right? And unfortunately, how that has hit not just society, but also how we conduct our work. As many of us, and most of us today, are probably working from home, it has caused a overnight reinvention of the workplace. So I'd like to discuss a little bit about what do we see there from a security perspective, since there's been so much discussed about what the security challenges now in this new workplace environment have come into view. And lastly, talking about the future that probably for some folks has already arrived in terms of artificial intelligence, the emergence of 5G networks, and then the massive explosion of IoT devices and the security issues around the trio that is opening up a whole new set of threat surfaces. Next slide. So let's double click into each of these. Again, starting with the first one, which was enterprise cloudification. Here at Dell'Oro, we're renowned for the quantitative research we do on the markets and being able to understand what's happening at the ground level from not just the market perspective, but the vendor performance within those markets. And I picked out a couple of sample sets, one of my own and one from my peer who covers data center capital expenditures. But over the course of the last 5 years, cloud has been all over, right? Enterprises are all in on cloud. As you can see here, the market has exploded for the public service providers, going 41% compound annual growth from 2014 to 2019. And when we look at it from security spend, it hasn't been too shabby. When you look at it from the perspective of physical appliances, which probably are not as popular any longer as we move into this highly cloud environments, they've still grown 7% over the same 5 years. But virtual and SaaS-based security has definitely not just kept up, but slightly exceeded the revenue spend or the cloud revenue from these public cloud service providers. So 45% compound annual growth. So the takeaways here is that people are going to the cloud and they're spending a fair amount of money from their budgets on security. Next slide, please. But yet we see that enterprises are still failing. I picked out a couple of articles that I saw in major publications. The first one from Wall Street Journal, how human error is really at many times at the root of why people mess up their cloudification when they move to the public cloud service providers. The specific example comes by the way of New York Times when they did an expose on the Capital One data breach that happened in July, which all boiled down to misconfiguration of a firewall AWS, and it wasn't AWS's fault. It really was the operators on Capital One that misconfigured and fat fingered something. But when you look at the complexity that they're dealing with, it's not really surprising, because when you look at something like the Amazon S3 Console user guide, which is a very popular service offered by AWS for their customers, it's over 130 pages long. So you just got to get it right. And so it's a daunting task to make sure that every last configuration knob is set on the right setting to make sure that you don't get hacked. Next slide. Switching gears here to the second topic that we'll be discussing today in this workplace reinvention. Who would have thought that 2020 turned out the year that it has been? And it has caused this overnight reinvention of the workplace. I modeled here using census data as well as World Bank data, just how the world for the enterprise workforce changed overnight, literally. And so coming into pre-pandemic, there was about 100 million worldwide remote workers on a full-time basis. And that pivoted nearly 3 times over the course of the beginning of 2020 when the pandemic hit. Now, where do we expect to land? At least my crystal ball says that it's going to be somewhere in the middle here, where it's going to be twice as much as where we came from, but not at the same levels and intensity that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. And this has all really caused a lot of conversation and discussion about how IT security strategy needs to morph and evolve to be able to address that. Next slide. And one of the first things that we've seen is how the industry is getting SASE. No, I'm not talking about how they're becoming obstinate. I'm talking about Secure Access Service Edge, which is aiming to combine a number of solutions and capabilities to be able to address the needs of the customers. And so the revenue streams are quite big, and the opportunity is quite large in this particular market, going from very small to extremely big. Next slide, please. And lastly, the future is here, right? With AI, 5G, and IoT. Now, 5G is going to unleash a network with megabit to gigabit speeds everywhere. 50 billion devices from an IoT perspective. And then let's not even start with AI in terms of just how it's already left an impact on society with its ability to unleash innovation in magnificent ways, whether it be in medicine, whether it be in the field of security as well, so cybersecurity, and we'll talk a little bit about what the role is within cybersecurity. But all of these new technologies come with a soft underbelly. So next slide, please. I picked out a couple of articles highlighting the soft underbelly of these new technologies. So in the cyber defense, 5G, they identified at least 6 new vulnerabilities that aren't present in the existing cellular networks at 4G. New York Times, we've all heard of this, about how hackers have hacked into home security solutions, or in the same way, how hackers have been able to hack gas station pumps and be able to pump gas for free. And probably one of the most insidious examples is how fraudsters recently used AI to mimic a CEO's voice in order to get the leader of a business, a CEO, to transfer a large amount of funds into the fraudster's bank account. So this shows how both the technology that could help society and all of us to move forward can also be used by the hacking community in order to cause havoc in the environments. So with that, I've teed up a couple of very interesting topics for you guys this morning, and I'd like to turn it over to our panel to be able to dissect each of these ones individually, starting with the enterprise cloudification. So next slide, please. So let's dig a little deeper. A couple of starting questions to get the conversation going this morning. What are we getting right? What are we getting wrong? And what are the considerations for the future? I'd like to tee this up first with, why not you, Ron? Why don't you take a first crack at this, and we'll get the conversation going.
Mauricio, thank you very much for that question, and to our audience. good morning or good evening, wherever you might be. I think it's probably fair to say with regard to cloud, I spent a lot of time in the government, and one of the things in the way that I like to frame my answer is that in the government, the business case is prominent, but not necessarily an existential endeavor, because there's no profit involved in the government. But in the private sector, completely different. So the business case is preeminent in the private sector and makes excellent business sense. And so the idea and the notion of cloud is that cloud allows for the customization of need. So if I'm a business and I've got to look at spend on things like IT, the elasticity of the cloud makes complete sense. And so in terms of what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong, because it's cyber, right is not necessarily a binary endeavor. It's not, this is right, this is wrong. Right is an adaptation. And so the notion of right means, hey, let's take a look at number one in terms of cloudification. It's as much about the journey as it is about once all of your data is in the cloud. So there's a tremendous conversation surrounding how do I get, let's say if I'm coming from on-prem to the cloud, how do you do that? And the answer is that we're seeing it's either stepwise or big bang. Stepwise means what you think it is. You do it incrementally, you start to move some applications, and that's the way that you do it. Big bang means that you're all in. But the point is, when you're doing these things, that continuum of what's right, it's all about, a couple of things that I'll just refer to as the golden rules. Protect your S3 buckets. Instead of your servers on-prem, it's all about S3 buckets, your data storage, how you protect those things. Turn on your DLP, use multi-factor authentication. Here's a big one for me is begin to think about micro-segmentation. Use that in terms of your business process. These are all of the things that we are getting right. And the other thing is that, right today is not necessarily what right will look like in 6 months, because it's all about adaptation and how you move data from point A to point B. So we are in an environment where complexity is increasing, and you've got to be adaptive to those things. I will say this now, and I will say this at the end of our chat today. We are working towards significantly increased complexity. And with increased complexity comes increased vulnerability. The ultimate question is, how can we be so advanced, but yet still so vulnerable? Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ron. So I guess I'm hearing that it's common sense, basic stuff. Let's get it right. If you get that right, then you shouldn't be in a too terrible a position. Thanks for those comments. Anyone else from the panel want to take a stab?
Yeah, this is John. I'll jump in here real quick, Mauricio, because one of the things people don't do is define the cloud, right? So the cloud is just a hypervisor that's owned by somebody else, not by you. And the native cloud security, when we talk about cybersecurity, the native cloud security is never going to be good enough because it's all based upon a Linux kernel, right? So it's all stateless ACLs at layer 3. And so it's a misunderstanding to think that you can actually secure the cloud based on the cloud technology. I mean, let's face it, Linus Torvalds should be the richest person in the world because of what he did with Linux. Without Linux, the cloud doesn't exist, but it doesn't have robust security features in here, and all hackers know how to bypass layer 3 controls. So this is the fundamental problem, is that I feel like I'm living in at the turn of the century, back when we were still at layer 3 security and we hadn't moved up the stack yet, and we need to move up the stack in cloud security and do it as robustly as we do it in our data center, or at least as some people do it in the data center, because the cloud is just a data center that somebody else owns. And so, you know, there is no shared responsibility model. The cloud provider will always say it's not my fault, not my fault, not my fault. And so you have to understand that if you're going to go into the cloud.
This is Joe Sullivan. Let me jump in for a sec. I think when I think of this transition, it's good to zoom out from the technology and think about the structural organizational approaches. The business-related technology teams are running towards the cloud. The security teams are getting dragged along. And that's because they have different mindsets. The business leaders are just looking at cost and opportunity, and the cloud provides efficiency and the ability to focus on the priorities of the business, you know, the front end of the website, the user experience, things like that, and not worry about infrastructure. And so that's really appealing to the business side of the company. The security team looks at the cloud and for years has just seen risk. You could go to any large security conference up to a year and a half ago, and if you talk to the security leaders, they were not moving their security tools into the cloud. They were uncomfortable with security products that were cloud-based. If they were given a choice to set up an on-prem security solution, they would opt for it. And they were kind of resistant to what the company was doing in terms of the move to the cloud. It does feel like in the last couple of years, security teams have started to come around. Just look at all the stories of the data breaches in the cloud, and you realize security teams need to get with the program and be focused on understanding, appreciating the risks, and being actively involved when the business teams are running to the cloud and not getting dragged along. Similarly, we see the same thing right now, whereas I think storage and compute moved to the cloud really quickly and easily. The rest of the hardware that was left was the networking equipment and the security equipment. The security equipment's slowly moving to the cloud. The networking equipment's moving to the cloud right now. And the teams are still having trouble giving up their own hardware for that cloud-based hardware. And you know, the forward-leaning security teams are starting to run to keep up with the rest of the company, and they're doing better. And hopefully we'll see less of these cloud-based issues and incidents.
Yeah, this is Kevin. I'll just add that I think Joe's right that the technology is lagging a little bit to address the security concerns in the cloud. They're sort of still operating on this peripheral security model, but many of the companies, including Joe's, have actually started to look at really hardening the inside of the data center, because that peripheral model was effective in the enterprise. But when you move to the cloud, you actually need to move up the entire stack, as John was talking about. So layer 3 ACLs isn't enough. You need to go all the way to the application. And to do that, there's been a fairly high penalty for deploying software-defined security. So some of the folks have looked and talked about even as much as 30% of the CPU cycles when you move to this software-defined. And that's not just security, that's also storage and networking. But one of the things that's happening, companies like ourselves and others are catching up and accelerating that. So we have software defined and hardware accelerated so that you can deploy these models where everything is software defined in the cloud. You get that elasticity, but you get the benefits of hardware acceleration. So I call that a M&M security model, which is hard on the outside, but soft on the inside. In the cloud, we need a jawbreaker model where it's hard on the outside and hard on the inside, all the way to the application layer.
Thanks, Kevin, for that. I guess what I'm hearing from the panelists is it's almost like the basic issues that we've been dealing with is people, technology, and processes, right? So I think that's what I'm hearing come through. Is there anyone else with some thoughts to offer?
Yeah, Mauricio, I just wanted to comment that one of the things we really need to think about is automation. As we move to the cloud, and really making sure that we're building controls that prevent the mistakes from happening in the first place. Because when we look at it, most of the breaches in the cloud, as you mentioned, are human caused. It's human error. It's publishing a key on your GitHub account and making it available to the public. So the more automation we use and the more configuration management we use, I think the more we're going to be ahead of the curve. and we lower our mean time to detection of mistakes as well.
I think that makes sense. That makes very great sense. Well, good. I think let's keep moving to the next topic. So our next topic is, like I said, about the reinvention of the workplace that took place frankly, overnight this year due to the pandemic. And I want to get the panel's viewpoints on remote work. Is it here to stay? And if it is, or even if it's just going to be a larger part of the landscape, how does IT security strategy need to evolve? Since what I've been hearing is more of reactionary types of band-aids that enterprises have put in place, since it was not really a well thought out plan when everyone shifted to remote work. So what's the panelist's thoughts? And John, why don't we start with you this time in terms of what your thoughts are on this topic?
Yeah, I'm lucky. I have a very unique perspective on this because not only do I work in cybersecurity, I created Zero Trust, and I work for the company that has the #1 remote work technology in the world. But I also have a brother-in-law who is the top COVID specialist in Dallas here. So I get to hear that side of the story too. And yeah, remote work is here to stay. We're seeing people who are actually increasing their productivity because people aren't wasting their time at the water cooler. Most people in their jobs spend a lot of time looking for a conference room so they can have a quiet place to work, because these open office things were great for the people who sold that stuff, but not really great for productivity. But on the other side, I think if you're in IT or cybersecurity, the technologies were here and ready for people to adopt. People just hadn't adopted them, but we're the great unsung heroes of coronavirus. Without the technology that had already been built, and without the people who were moving very, very quickly to implement it, right? I had customers who did 3 years of work in 3 months because it was so easy to deploy now. Without us, more people would be sick, more people would die. And so we need to understand that we contributed a lot to the health and safety and well-being of the world, because we have these technologies in place where 20 years ago, when I first met you, Mauricio, I mean, maybe it wasn't that long ago, but a long time ago, that would have been very, very hard to roll out. And now you can just flip a switch, because these technologies are cloud-based, they're agile, they're automated. And if you did that in your company, pat yourself on the back and know that you saved some lives.
Thanks for those thoughts, John. But let me flip it on its head. So we've saved a lot of personal lives, but in doing so, we've now stretched the boundaries of the enterprise in ways that had never been really contemplated, because now there's personal information and access to data sets from not just a limited set of spots or sites. It's now distributed through every last employee in there and wherever they may be working from. So from a cyber security perspective, doesn't that introduce a huge new soft underbelly to take advantage of?
Well, let me jump in. This is Joe. Fundamentally, if we think about the last topic in cloudification, it wasn't just our compute and processing and storage that was moving to the cloud, but also a lot of our applications have already moved to the cloud through all the proliferation of SaaS apps. In my mind, what changed with COVID was the last step of moving everything out of the enterprise network, which is the employee laptops. And so we've been in this transition to the quote unquote borderless world for many years. We just, again, as security professionals, we were getting dragged along kicking and screaming. And so our compute went to the cloud, our storage went to the cloud, most of our apps went to the cloud, and now our employees have also stepped out from behind that the network environment. When we modeled security in our companies 10 years ago, we drew this big network perimeter, and we had that that M&M approach of that hard shell. And now we've eliminated the network edge altogether. And COVID kind of was the death knell to the VPN in a lot of ways for a lot of companies, because the VPNs just couldn't, they were the last, part of keeping employees inside the network perimeter, and VPNs just couldn't handle the traffic. And we saw a lot of companies switching very quickly during the spring and summer to go implement better security in different areas. And so if you lose the network edge, you have to think about what are the other areas where your security can get better. And that's where SASE really got legs, I think, and got defined as a term, because of the increased focus on authentication and what's happening at the laptop level and everywhere in between, but without the VPN.
Now, Joe, I want to take a little bit of an exception to one thing you said, which is this mythology that somehow we're killing VPNs, and we're not. All these network connections, these remote connections, are still VPNs, right? It doesn't matter what protocol, whether it's IPsec or TLS that you're connecting, you're still encrypting a tunnel across the public internet. So there's only two ways to send traffic across the internet: clear text or encrypted. So there's still VPNs. Now we just need layer 7 policy inside those VPNs. We can extend zero trust, which Gardner talks about as SASE, or zero trust network access. But I've been doing this for 12 years now. So none of this stuff feels new to me. It's just the world is finally catching up to where it needs to go. But we aren't killing VPNs. VPNs are here to stay. I mean, that's one of the great misnomers and one of the great irritants of me, because people talk about zero trust killing the VPN, and it's not. It's giving the VPN layer 7 policy and more robustness than it ever had before.
Yeah,
I
would be killing.
I think, Kevin, I would echo what John said. I think if anything, this whole cloudification and working from home is probably amplifying the requirements for VPN. So I think Joe's point was valid in the sense that it's not just the traditional layer 3 or even layer 4 with DLS VPN, but going all to the application stack. I think what we're seeing again is that this will be deployed much more broadly. And so it's great to have John here, because he sort of pioneered zero trust when he was on the analyst side, and then went and implemented it at a corporate level. I think the key there is, building the architecture is great, but then you need to map everything, all of the flows of data, and create the right policies, and then monitor and maintain that. And so if you look at it from a networking perspective and where we're trying to accelerate things, it's actually much on that, yes, the policies and things like IPsec and TLS acceleration and hardware is important, but the monitoring and the maintenance is almost more important, because people don't actually break IPsec or TLS. These algorithms are solid. What happens is people leave their keys out in public, or they create a policy that allows people to, instead of just exchanging video across the network, go access huge amounts of files and data. So it's not about the encryption policies, TLS and IPsec. Yes, those are important, and we can accelerate that in hardware, but it's really all the monitoring and maintenance and making sure the policies that are deployed are accurate.
Thanks for that color, Kevin. Let me back up the conversation a little bit, because I think we went down in terms of the technology path. And what I'm hearing is at least a consensus that from a technology and process perspective, we're okay to be able to address this new landscape of remote working. But I feel that from the wetware, the people, right, the employees, the workforce, are they really in a position to be able to be as secure at home as teleworkers? Because at least what I've seen year in year out is that it's the people, when they do dumb things, that then lead to massive security breaches. So I just fear that now that we've gone to this hybrid distributed, yes, we've got the VPN controls and we've got technologies to be able to address the use case in a very secure fashion. But I sense that the processes and the security awareness that's necessary to make sure that the enterprise is secure in this new distributed environment is as good as it once was, when everything was much more concentrated and people coming into offices. Do people agree or disagree?
Mauricio, can I jump in for a second, please?
Sure.
No, I think you've hit on the point that is oftentimes missed in a fairly technical security conversation. At the end of the day, we have people who are millennials who are working in a multi-generational household that are working in their kitchen. I mean, that's what we're really dealing with. And so, you know, I work in a regulated environment, and now all of a sudden we've taken folks that are, you know, they're in their basement or they're in the kitchen with perhaps mom and dad, little ones in the house, and others who have access to their screens. And so, no, I think that has introduced, you know, additional vulnerabilities that are just flat out difficult to deal with. But there's an opportunity there. It's an opportunity to drive the conversation about hygiene. There's an opportunity to drive the individual workplace policies, perhaps have people sign attestations, but that's the deal. I mean, that's the elephant in the room, is that I've gone from a workplace to my kitchen with 5 other people in the same space. That's the deal, and that's what we're facing.
But I think us as security people have to understand that transition. And like, I think that, you know, the well-known Twitter hack situation from a couple of months ago is a great example of this, where, you know, an internal customer support tool that was probably built when it was behind a VPN, or built when it was like designed to be part of a corporate network, the company had to expose it to the internet so that they could have remote workforce access it to provide support during COVID. But that was controlled by password access. And so they were focused on like very basic authentication only. And what I've seen other companies do, and what, for example, we did with our customer support tools when we had to provide that, was we made sure, using our own SASE product, to have that tool locked down to only hard keys as a second factor of authentication. Similar to an old, you know, to the old-fashioned RSA tokens, or however you want to think about it. Having that physical hard key as a requirement was something that was painful to implement and make sure that every employee physically had one, but took a lot of the risk out of the hands of the employees. And that's what I think we see a lot of companies starting to do right now.
Yeah, Joe, I didn't mean to suggest that it was one problem. It's not one problem to the exclusion of the other. I work in a regulated environment where we have lots and lots of PII, but at the end of the day, we've got many of our folks that are working at their kitchen table, and there's all kinds of chaos in that environment. And that's a very, very difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah, we
So
definitely.
Mauricio,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I just wanted to take the counter position, because I think we can provide the same policy, the same control on a remote workforce as we can for in-house. And I think, you know, I take exception to when people talk about people doing stupid things. I'm tired of us in security blaming the victims, because this is too hard to solve by human beings. It needs to be solved technologically. You know, spam and phishing is a technological problem. It's not a security awareness problem. And so I don't think that we can solve it with the human factor. We need to do our jobs the right way, and to put the right policies in place and the right level of technology. And then these things don't become an issue. And but we're, again, sometimes I think we're lazy and we want to blame the victims. And I'm just not willing to blame the victims anymore. You know, when I hear people say you can't fix stupid, I go ballistic, man. That just is, you know, I shouldn't be doing my own payroll, and they shouldn't be doing their own security. Everybody should do their own job, as Bill Belichick famously says.
And John,
And you make a fair point. Go ahead, Mary.
I agree with you that it's a technology problem, but I think we're right in the middle of a transition. I came to a technical company from being in healthcare. And when I was in healthcare, there wasn't that much money spent on technology, just in general, much less security. So I think there's got to be a pivot. And while we're in the middle of the pivot, I'm really concerned about, you know, we're asking a lot of people to work in a household with children, with nephews, nieces, whatever. But we've also got, I'm going to skip to IoT for a minute. You know, I've got my robotic vacuum on my network now. And we're kind of asking the layperson to become a network engineer. How do they segment their IoT devices from the laptop that I need to protect? That's the endpoint to the healthcare record. So I think there's a bit of a rub there, but I agree with you, John, that we have to solve it from a technical perspective. But how do we put the tools and the education in the hands of the people who are implementing these controls in a home office? So that's kind of my thought.
And I guess I don't want to go back to John's comment, and thank you, Mary, because I think you summarized it well in saying that it's not one particular thing here. And I always look at it as a three-legged stool, right? So people, processes, and technology. And so I think it's all about being able to move forward across all of those three dimensions, but not necessarily picking out and saying, yes, the people are to always be the blame. But at least from what I'm hearing in our discussion today, is that yes, we move into this new brave new world. A lot of the fundamental technologies there, a lot of the fundamental processes are there. Yes, it's scary at certain times to now think that there is a millennial with a bunch of people around them in chaos in the home kitchen, but that we're not that the gap between where we are now to where we may need to be or where we need to be isn't that large. At least that's the sense that I'm getting from our conversation this morning. Is that fair? Well, good. Well, keeping on the to our last topic here, why don't we go to the discussion 3? And I think Mary, you already started to tee it up with your IoT comment, but the last one is looking towards the future, right? So we hear a lot about AI now in terms of in security solutions in society in general. 5G that's starting to become the next wave in cellular networking technology. And Mary, you're already touching in terms of how IoT's permeating our lives, not just in an industrial level, but even at home at a consumer level. So I wanted to tee up a couple questions in order for us to have the conversation around this topic. And the questions are is it fear and excitement that you get when you hear these three terms, and what are the security considerations, and lastly, what are the steps we should be taking now in order to make sure that when we get deep into this new world with AI, 5G, and IoT, that we don't suffer the consequences and get hacked, as if we will, if we don't really think about where we're going. And Mary, since you already started to tee up a little bit, why don't you take a step first at answering some of these questions?
So the first thing is, for me, it's excitement. I love technology. I think as security professionals, we need to be more willing to adopt new technologies and more open-minded about how we adopt them and enable our businesses to adopt them and our customers. And part of that, John, to go back to your statement about these are technology problems, how do we get the IoT vendors to start building the right controls into their products? I bought a mesh network kit at the beginning of the pandemic, and it actually said in the instruction book, keep your passwords the same so you don't have to change passwords on all of your devices. And I was just like, really? So how do we as security professionals hold our businesses up to deploying technologies that are secure, that are coded well, and especially when we're selling to end users who may not be as savvy as we are when we're deploying these technologies. So I think part of it is being good consumers and really driving security into the products and teaching others how to vote with their feet, right? If you're going out and buying an IoT device that won't let you change the admin password, return it. And just some simple tips and tricks like that. So maybe we don't have to teach all of our home users how to be network admins.
Frustrating.
If I can add to that, Mary, a line of questioning there. So what I'm hearing you say is educate the consumer, but is there a role for legislation here, right? Because if we look at the safety of products in the past, it's been through legislation and raising the security bar. So do you feel that there's a role for legislation to make sure there's some form of a UL stamp of approval here in the States, where we use UL as an electrical safety standard, but do so from a security perspective for consumer IoT devices?
So I have a tendency to look at legislation as setting a low bar. So I hate to say it that way, but if I look at compliance versus security, if I build security processes into my environment, I'm going to be compliant. But if I shoot for compliance, I'm not going to be secure. I'm going to meet the checks. So I don't know that we can drive change in the industry through legislation. We can get people to follow the checklist. But ultimately, we live in an ecosystem now where what I do from a security perspective in my company impacts everybody on this call. So we have responsibilities to each other to make sure that we're not putting out a bot that can be used by the Russian hackers and their 13-year-old bot herders to run a DDoS attack on Amazon or AWS. So I think one of the things we need to do is, as a community, start really advocating to build some of these things into the DNA of our companies and our thought processes.
So it falls on the leaders of the security side. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I would echo what Mary said there is, if we're going to rely on government, I think we're going to be in trouble because they're going to be shooting behind the 8 ball. It just can't move fast enough. So it's really incumbent on all of the industry. And, we're intimately involved with AI, 5G, and IoT. And we think it's just going to change the world. And we need to make sure that all of those changes are safe and secure. And the industry needs to do that together. And, we have the framework here with the zero trust model. Anything that plugs into the network isn't trusted, and you need to authenticate it, and you need to have policies associated with the rules and the roles that it's able to do. And all of the data needs to be encrypted. So even if there are breaches, which inevitably there will be, the role of that device needs to be very limited. And so even to the point where the models that are deployed, these deep neural network models for AI, the models that are running the 5G and all of the policies, everything is going to be software defined and hardware accelerated in this new world. And we need to actually protect even the models. That can be the most powerful, valuable thing you have is your AI model. And so the notion of, what's called in the data center confidential computing models is now being extended to the edge, and even things like AI. The models themselves will be protected. So there's a lot of new technology that needs to be employed. But I agree, I think it was John that said we can't blame the users. Somebody who plugs something in, we can't blame the users. We need to protect them as an industry. And I think we have all the tools to do that. But it's incumbent on us and to provide the transparency so that the marketplace sees whether or not we're taking this security seriously and really protect all of our customers together.
If I could jump in for a minute, I want to go back to people and introduce a concept that we typically don't have in and amongst a security conversation, at least a cyber conversation. And I think fundamentally, we make better technology when we better understand human behavior. And so what I mean is simply this: there's a reason why people text and drive. They text and drive because when they hear that indication on their phone, you get a hit of anticipatory dopamine in your brain. And it's almost very similar to what happens with people who are addicted to narcotics. And what you could say is, yeah, we could fix that with the technology by putting an accelerometer in your phone and simply not let you do that. But the point is that there has to be some merger of the psychology of technology and how people interact with the technology. I agree, we have to protect people, but you hear almost nothing about why people do what they do. That's how you build better technology.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. When I think about the IoT devices, there's been debate for years about legislation or regulation, and it feels like it's too late now for that, if there was such a thing as good legislation, because there's too many devices out there. But if those untrusted devices just didn't work well because when they tried to reach out and connect to our more trusted environments, they were blocked, the consumers would stop buying them, they'd complain about them, and they would move towards more trusted IoT devices just because of performance. And so I think that's ultimately what's going to happen with some of these less trusted IoT devices. But in the meantime, we're in a pretty rough space with a large number of DDoS attacks happening right now from IoT devices, and no real kind of customer pain, so to speak.
That's because you're doing such a good job, Joe, with stopping those DDoS attacks on the edge, right? You and Mary and the technologies you have are solving that problem, right? Before it gets to the people who get really affected by it. So I think you've done that. And somehow, Kevin being the hardware guy, the chip guy, we've got to incentivize these manufacturers to be willing to add a 25-cent feature to their IoT device, because when they look at it from a business perspective, 25 cents over 10 million devices is a huge amount to add to it. And why would they do that? Because they don't care about security. And yeah, we have to have everybody care about this stuff, but we've got people on this call who are solving these things all the time. It's just people aren't fully adopting what Mary and Joe and Kevin and me and my company offers. So if you adopt these technologies, we can solve the problems for you. You just have to be willing to do it, and you have to be willing to spend a little money, right? As Mary said, in the healthcare industry, man, those guys are cheap. Let me tell you, those guys are so cheap, right? They'll spend so much money on an MRI machine, but they won't spend a little bit of money to lock the MRI machine down.
So I'm trying to tease out in terms of what are the concrete steps we should be taking now, and what I'm hearing from the panel is that it's really a multi-pronged approach in terms of education, but I also hear a lot of grassroots. So we can't let the legislators come in, because and I agree, by the way, that they're going to set the bar too low or shoot behind the duck. So then, what is this a call to action for the rest of the security leaders to embrace and say, we're gonna advocate and evangelize that if we're gonna embrace IoT, we have to do it securely, and we have to do these things? Is that the real call to action today in terms of concrete steps? I see a lot of nodding heads, so I guess.
Yeah, I would say Mary made a really good point about getting our security teams to embrace the new technology and get excited about it. We can't have the security team be the laggard at the company. The security team needs to be out there learning about the new technology and embracing it, testing it, understanding the risks.
Fair. In these last couple of minutes, let me dig a little deeper on AI and 5G, and let me take AI. And so you saw in my presentation how AI can both help, but also severely hurt. What's the perspective with the panel in terms of the role of AI in cybersecurity? Is it fear or excitement, and which way are things going?
Yeah, I'll jump in and address some things first. We're really excited because we actually see some things that we can do with AI that we simply can't do otherwise. And going back to this whole notion of, monitoring everything and the flow of data and traffic, here we had a long discussion on encrypted data and IPsec. And suddenly all of these monitoring tools that you have that will look at, really layer 4 through layer 7, everything becomes opaque. Everything's encrypted. You can't really look at anything. And this is an area where, on at least the networking side, we can apply AI and start to look at activities that is really meta information. So we're not able to do the deep packet inspection. We can scan, servers in real time at 100 gigabits per second for threats, for intrusion protection and malware. That's something we can do. But as we're moving into this encrypted environment where everything is opaque data, suddenly you start to need to look at flows and connections that are starting and sort of all of the meta information. And AI, this is something that, just dumping a bunch of log files isn't going to give you any information here. So we think that, it's way beyond a human capacity to look at what's happening and detect anomalies. But we think with AI that you can start to actually understand what's happening, even if everything that's moving across the wire is encrypted.
So we got to check on the plus that, at least for you, Kevin, it's excitement and doing interesting things. Any alternative views?
Well,
Is
I
it
mean,
excitement across the board?
No, I think from a security perspective, it's massive amounts of excitement because, you can't, a human being can't do what a computer can do in terms of cybersecurity, looking through all the data, correlating all that information, seeing the behaviors, tracking, the metadata. So that's exciting, but it's like every technology that's ever been invented. There's bad uses for it as well. And so, we just have to be prepared for that. And so it's not a binary thing, good or bad, but dang, it's really exciting to see what we can do to stop bad things from happening because we have the ability to computationally understand things at a level that no human being could do. I used to look at these log files, and my joke is that every SOC analyst is colorblind, right? Because you've chased your tail so long that every red alert turns green. So now we can know what's real versus what's illusory, and man, it's exciting times to be in cybersecurity.
I love that
And in terms of
of security analysts chasing log files. That's great. I'm going to use that.
But you hit on something, John, there in terms of how technologies have both good purposes, but as well as bad purposes or evil purposes. In terms of AI being applied from the hacking community, is that something that should be on CISO's radar already, or what's the perspective in terms of taking steps against the emerging rise of AI, not just within the enterprise for good purposes, but as I pointed out, even on the hacker side?
Well, yeah, we have
Is
to
there
be
really a
aware
way
of that.
to?
Yeah, we have to be aware of that. But we have a little bit of an advantage because they still have to transport those attacks across the same networks that exist today. So TCP/IP is the thing that's common to everybody. And so we have a good handle on that, and we can know how to secure that. And the transport, and even as we go to 5G, right, which isn't necessarily the same thing, but it's going to translate in terms of how we get to the data. So it's, again, transport is one thing, security and layer 7 policy is a second thing, and understanding what we need to protect. If we can protect that stuff, then yeah, they can attack us, but I mean, there's amazing things that we're all doing here on this call that are going to stop them, right? I mean, just the ability to have Cloudflare or F5 deliver you a clean pipe is huge. And so we just need to get on board with allowing those people to do the right thing.
Good, good. Well, it's good to hear that even the security practitioners that usually a pretty security or paranoid bunch are really excited about these new technologies. And I too am excited about the brave new future. Well, with that, I think we're getting here into the tail end of our time together. So George, next slide. So yes, I'd like to offer up the panel, and again, thank you for everyone contributing their thoughts today, to offer up some parting conclusions or last tidbits before we conclude and jump into the Q&A session. So Joe, we'll start with you and then just go here on the order of the slide that we're sharing. So any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I think if I were to summarize kind of the topics you chose, they all fit under one umbrella, which is technology, and the way people are using it is changing really quickly, and probably faster and faster every year. And you have events like COVID that push things that maybe we would have been getting to 3 years from now into now, in terms of remote workforces and the technology we need to secure them. But that's how technology is, and that's how security, that's why a lot of us are in security, because there's never a day when you wake up and you say, my work is done. It's always a day when you wake up and say, what's the new challenge today and what's the challenge of tomorrow? And that's the exciting and rewarding part of security. These are some daunting challenges, but like with people in security, like this panel, and the companies that we work for, we're in a good place. We're probably in a better place than we were 5 years ago, and that was better than 5 years before that. And so it's good that we're getting together and talking about these issues and thinking about the threats together.
Thank you. Mary, on to you.
I agree with Joe. It's a brave, new, exciting world with lots of technology that introduces risks, but also gives us benefits. They're force multipliers. They're huge capabilities in terms of not only enabling the security teams, but the businesses. And from a security perspective, we're here to enable our business to move faster, right? In a safe manner, and make sure our customers are protected and data is protected. So I'm really excited about the challenges that are going forward. I wake up every day and learn something new. So I think it's really great that we're sitting here talking about this, and that we're going to work together to make things better and more secure and move faster.
Thank you for that, Mary. On to you, Kevin.
Yeah, I think we've identified lots of different capabilities that we need to deploy. And I think automation and monitoring and really doing everything in a scalable, cloudified manner with microservices is the key. So we can't rely on individuals to protect themselves. We really need to have the policy. But I loved also what Ron said about, but human behavior is important too. So we need to do both. And I think we need to create the incentives to do that. We can do the technology side from, AI and IoT and 5G and encryption, but we also need to work closely with all the partners so that we affect the human changes as well that are needed to protect the environment.
Thanks for that, Kevin. We're 3 for 3 in terms of the positive. John, are we going to keep on the positive track, or?
Well,
what are your
the
thoughts?
technology is always positive. It gets better and better. I mean, I'm really old, so I can remember, X25 networks and all kinds of things that were really clunky. So everything works really good. I'm not really amazed when things break. I'm more amazed that they actually work pretty well, right? Considering how young this business is. But we're talking about technology. Technology is always going to change. We're going to have to adapt to that technology, but we're going to have to actually think about the things we protect, I think, more than just the technology, because we've been talking a lot about transport and that kind of stuff. And but there's data that we need to protect, and there's PII and PHI and all these things that we talk about. And what we need to never forget is behind every credit card number that is stolen, every credit report that is stolen, every piece of PII that is stolen and used maliciously, there's a human being behind that. And I think sometimes we're at this level of breach fatigue where we go, oh, that was only 100 million records at that S3 bucket instead of 400 million. That was a small breach, but that's 100 million people that are affected. And so to go back to the people part, yeah, we changing incentives to drive the proper behaviors is important, but understanding that this is about protecting people, and what we do in cybersecurity affects real human beings in real positive ways if we have the right attitude about it.
Thanks for that, John. Last but not least, Ron, what are your thoughts?
So I think that we're just, every time you get involved in one of these kind of conversations, you realize how fortunate we are to be in an era of have front row seats to the trajectory of the technology. I mean, so many of us on this call, do you remember slide rules? HP 41s. It's not all that long ago, but you look at what we can do now in our back pocket. So a couple things. The world has changed. The world has changed a lot. We see increased complexity, which brings with it increased vulnerability. One of the things that I said early on was that how can we be so advanced, but yet we still have significant strands of vulnerability? So we need to think about that. We also need to think about the people part of this. I mean, that's an aspect that needs to have increased penetration in our security space, because I do think that that's how we're going to mold better technology and better techniques to protect people. And here's the other thing. At the end of the day, in our business environments, we are a piece of the business that propels the business forward. I think we need to do a better job with introducing ourselves as, what does security folks do? If you ask others what they do, they'll say, well, those are the guys that always slow us down. They're always the people that tell us no, right? And so we've got to do a better job at explaining why we do what we do. And I think, it's an ongoing conversation. As I said earlier, right is all about not necessarily right, it's about adaptation. So I'm very appreciative for being on the panel, and very appreciative for the esteemed colleagues that we have assembled here today.
Thanks for that, Ron. And I'll echo Ron's comments. Thank you very much for participating. And I'm really glad to hear that the positive vibe that I got today during the conversation. Going into this, I wasn't necessarily thinking that it was going to be so positive, given that it's 2020 and the wheels have really come off a lot of things this year. But looking towards the future with folks such as yourselves at the helm of important institutions and firms, I think we're going to be okay. Well then, again, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. I feel at the conclusion here in a much more positive state, even on the personal level, than coming in, right? Because I didn't think that our conversation would have such positive overtones, but I'm really glad that I did hear that, because it then says that we're in the right strategic direction. Doesn't mean that we're going to solve every last security issue or be able to deal with the new threats that may be coming at us, every single one of them. But at least we have the right technology, we have the right mindset to be able then to embrace this momentous level of change that is happening, and be able then, as I think has happened over the last 30 years of cybersecurity, ratchet it up and become much more formidable against what is a very scary and world full of security threats and hackers.